Chapter 32. It was hot in the armored car. Malone was sweating profusely, and so were the Port Authority cops. There was barely enough room for the 4 men inside the steel-plated vehicle. Malone felt cramped and uncomfortable, wedged into the small space beside the driver, and the nasty stench of gasoline fumes added to his annoyance. It was noisy in there too. The sound level was 10 times as loud as that inside an ordinary car. The naked metal walls magnified the mechanical growl of the engine. With narrow steel slits instead of the big rubber-sheathed windows of civilian vehicles, almost none of the noise escaped. Malone peered through the small opening and tapped the driver's shoulder. The detective pointed left. He had worked this area in a patrol car when he was 2 years out of the police academy. He knew these streets. Well, he hoped he did. It had been a long time. The armored vehicle swerved as he'd ordered. It was 11 blocks to the intersection where the Coast Guard pilot waited. Finding him wasn't going to be difficult. Getting into the building that concealed the transmitter would be much trickier, Malone realized. There had to be a quick way in. Quick and sure. He saw it, dead ahead, a minute later. "Stop him!" he called to the driver. "Stop him!" The startled man behind the wheel swung the armored car directly across the path of a motorized snowplow that was moving slowly down the street. Malone opened the door beside him, scrambled out, and ran to the big Department of Sanitation truck. "What the fuck is this?" the irate driver yelled. "Police emergency," Malone replied, and pointed at the plainly marked Emergency Services Unit van and the blue and white radio cars behind the armored vehicle. The sanitation man opened his mouth to ask a question. Malone spoke first. "Follow us right now," he ordered. Then Malone hurried back to the armored car. When it reached the phone booth, he got out as a young man in an orange jumpsuit stepped from the shelter. Eyeing the heavy fabric and the outfit's design, the detective reasoned that it could be a flyer's winter gear. "You the chopper pilot?" The Coast Guard lieutenant nodded. "How far is it?" Malone demanded. 5 or 6 blocks, Saldana replied and pointed west. "Let's go." With Saldana and Malone leading the way on foot, the vehicles moved quietly through the deserted streets. None of the police in the ESU van said a word. They put on their steel battle helmets, checked the magazines in their weapons, and wondered whether the terrorists might have armor-piercing ammunition that could penetrate their police flak jackets. Those bulky garments were supposed to stop anything under .50 caliber, but who knew what the terrorists might be using? Suddenly, the Coast Guard flyer stopped. "I think it's around this corner, near the far end of the block," he said. Malone turned and held up his right hand. As the armored car and other police vehicles slowed to a halt, Malone walked to the ESU van to talk to the team's commander. When the wide-shouldered man in the flak jacket stepped down to the street, Frank Malone recognized him. 6 years ago, before Anthony Arbolino made lieutenant, Malone had barely defeated him for the department's pistol championship. Arbolino was more than a fine shot. He was a damn good cop. Neither man wasted a moment on amenities. "What have we got?" Arbolino asked bluntly. "Let's take a look." Arbolino gestured to the driver of the van. Looking larger than life-sized in their bulky body armor, the ESU cops climbed out as Malone and their commander hurried to join the helicopter pilot. With only his head extending beyond the corner, Saldana was warily peering up the block. He stepped back as the 2 police officers reached him. I think it's the third building from the end, the other side of the street, he told them. You think? Frank Malone asked. I only saw it for a couple of seconds as we flew over. There are 4 antennas on the roof, and something's projecting from the side of the chimney. None of us could figure out what it was. Is that all? There's a wire fence, maybe 4 or 5 feet high, running all around the roof. What about the building itself? Malone questioned. It seems to be a small warehouse. The anti-terrorist specialist leaned forward past the edge of the building, studied the third building from the end on the other side of the street, and then stepped back. Looks like a small 3-story warehouse, all right, he confirmed. It was then that the ESU team commander shook his head. I'm listening, Tony, Malone announced. Who's inside that building? Arbolino asked. Armed terrorists. How many? Malone shrugged. Well, what kind of weapons do they have? Assume the worst. These bastards probably have everything, Malone said. What bastards? Who are they, Frank? They could be West German. Their leader is. He's a goddamn monster. That's all I can say about him, Tony. Hope you don't mind. Let's see, Arbolino answered. We're not sure if it's the right building, and we don't know what the hell's rigged to the chimney, and we have no idea how many bad guys are in there. We don't know whether they've got bows and arrows or poison gas. You're not sure who these creeps are, and you won't trust me enough to say who their leader is. Well, how could any reasonable police lieutenant possibly mind taking his men into a terrific situation like that? Malone ignored the sarcasm. Tell your guys to bring their gas masks, Tony, Malone said evenly. We're hitting that warehouse as soon as you've got all the exits covered. It was a flat statement of fact, non-negotiable. Be nice if we knew that it was the right building, Arbolino pointed out. Can I borrow the flyboy for 5 minutes? 3 would be better. Arbolino turned towards the van, punching the air in a signal that the men beside it understood. An ESU sergeant rushed to him, listened to the orders, and went back to tell the others. Then Arbolino led the pilot around the block to the rear entrance of the building on the north side of the warehouse. Pushing Saldana back, Arbolino drew his pistol. For a moment, he considered the court decisions and departmental regulations about search warrants and legally justified entry. He shrugged, swung the gun, and smashed a glass panel in the door. After he reached in and opened it, he pulled a small flashlight from his rear pocket before they entered the building. There were tables heaped with fabric, sewing machines, and racks of dresses all over the room. It was a small clothing plant. Advancing behind the narrow beam of his flashlight, Arbolino led Saldana through the clutter to a freight elevator. They stepped out onto the roof 25 seconds later. The pilot pointed at the top of the adjacent building. The roof was ringed by a barbed wire fence that was nearly 5 feet high. 4 large antennas, unusual ones. Arbolino had never seen anything like them. And there was the tall smokestack. The police lieutenant stared through the snow for several seconds before he realized exactly what was jutting out halfway up the chimney. Christ, he whispered as he jerked Saldana back inside the clothing factory. In the warehouse next door, Takeshi Ito blinked. Then he rubbed his eyes and looked back at the television monitor again. There were 6 video screens facing him. Each of the half dozen was linked to a different closed-circuit camera. These state-of-the-art cameras were equipped with light intensification devices to provide superior night vision. Ito studied the monitor displaying what one of the roof cameras saw. Everything seemed normal. For a few seconds he thought he was looking at a human figure in some kind of bright orange garb, but there was clearly no one on the roof now. It must have been some kind of optical illusion, perhaps one caused by the flashing lightning. Orange clothing in New York in mid-winter. What a strange idea, Ito reflected. It was almost surreal, like those dreams in which a naked two-headed woman was choking him. Neither head had a face. Ito had never quite figured out what this unusual recurring fantasy represented. Now he saw something move. On the monitor linked to the camera scanning the street in front of the warehouse, a large white vehicle was approaching through the storm. It was difficult to identify. Ito squinted as he peered at it intently. After several seconds, he smiled and sighed. It was just a snowplow. With a major snowstorm battering the entire metropolitan area, it was natural for New York to send out its Department of Sanitation plows to clear the streets. This was both realistic and rational. No visions of imaginary men in bizarre orange attire. No nightmares of homicidal and faceless female freaks. Just a standard, non-military machine being operated by some unarmed and ordinary civil servants. A routine activity anywhere. It was almost time to depart. He would be glad to get out of this building, this situation, this country. He wasn't exhausted, but he had endured enough of the confinement and growing stress. He stood up, walked to the delayed action bombs, and deftly set the timers. Then he took another look at the bank of video screens. He saw the snowplow lumber around the corner and disappear. It hadn't really cleaned the street thoroughly. But that came as no surprise to Takeshi Ito. He understood that few Americans were committed to perfect work. He studied the clocks once more. This would be the last time. It was 9:30. In 3 minutes he would descend to his car in the garage below and start for Kennedy Airport.